President Biden has been in office for less than 3 months, and we have never seen an explosion in illegal immigration like what we're currently experiencing.
Biden signed the executive order. Overnight, it started back up again, and now they're catching at least 50 a day on the ranch.
And when people sit in Washington, D.C. and say, we don't have a humanitarian issue on the border, you need to come spend 24 hours with my team.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute.
You expect a certain amount of policies to change under a new administration. What is hard to understand is that they've removed policies that were effective and replaced them with no policies whatsoever.
The biggest difference with the people coming now is when Border Patrol catches them, they tell them, they said, we're going to stay here no matter what you do to us because your President Biden wants us.
that I will faithfully execute
The office of President of the United States.
the office of President of the United States
And will, to the best of my ability,
to the best of my ability.
preserve, protect, and defend.
Please welcome to the stage Senior Advisor to Government Relations, Mike Howell.
Hello, everyone. Now, how great was that last panel? That's a tough one to follow. And how awesome was that documentary? The Daily Signal is doing some of the best reporting out there on what's going on at the border. We can talk about, the fake news and CNN and MSNBC till we're blue in the face. But the issue is we got to get the real facts and the real story. And outlets like Daily Signal are the ones covering it. Everyone else is getting numb to it. They're not, and I'm thankful they're doing it. So I'm really, really pumped for our discussion we're about to have. We're going to talk about a pretty limited topic, challenges of leadership at home and abroad. It covers the entire world. So we're going to do it in an hour. But we got no better panel to do this than the folks that are about to join me. Now we have first up Dr. Kiron Skinner, who is Director of Policy Planning at the State Department under Trump. She's really the conscience of the American first foreign policy ideology. She's going to talk about what happened in the Trump administration and what's going wrong in the Biden administration. Next up, we have Congressman Michael McCaul. Congressman McCaul is the top Republican for Foreign Affairs in the House of Representatives. He also used to be the top Republican for Homeland Security in the House of Representatives, leading the committees there. And then we have former Secretary Chad Wolf, who I will say is my favorite former secretary because he actually secured the border. He got a lot done. He took the mission very seriously and got results. So now to discuss the what I'll say is the absence of leadership at home and abroad, let's welcome our guests for a quick discussion. Well, thank you all so much for being here. And just to let you all in the audience know, we'll move to questions after we do a quick run-through where each of our guests give a synopsis of how they see what's going on. So be thinking of your questions. Once we run through, we'll call on some. Now, Dr. Skinner, I'd like to start with you. I mean, I think one of the favorite things I hear you talk about is what you did in the Trump administration, kind of giving the ideological framework for an American first foreign policy. And now you're witnessing what's going on with the Biden administration. Can you kind of talk about, what happened and what's going wrong?
Yes, but first let me just thank all of you all for being here. This is one of my first flights in a year and a half, so it's good to feel halfway normal. And I hope we're going to continue. And I also would like to thank the Heritage leadership, President Kay James and her team, for moving forward through the COVID year, standing firm on the principles that we believe in. That was not easy. Heritage was at the forefront of American values at a very difficult time. My boss at Heritage, Jim Carafano, was incredibly encouraging. So this is just the beginning. I think we'll do a lot more, but it's good to get started. Now to your question, which is a really big one. The new administration talks about a middle-class-oriented foreign policy. That's the theme of what they're doing. I find that odd because I'm one of the few people who served in the administration who actually was on the Trump campaign. A lot of people showed up at the transition, but the campaign in 2016 was an important time because you had to take a lot of personal risk to go with Donald Trump. He was such an improbable candidate to begin with, and his victory, which many of us predicted, some in 2015, was even more improbable. So when you go back and look what he did in 2016, you see the template for what this administration is attempting to do now. Trump campaigned on a middle-class foreign policy without ever calling it. He just went and campaigned in those 30-odd flyover states, including my state of Pennsylvania, and talked to Americans about what mattered to them. And I think by listening to what they were concerned about, the Trump Doctrine emerged from it. And from the Trump Doctrine gets us the middle-class foreign policy of the Biden administration. What do I mean by that? Trump campaigned largely, not completely, on foreign policy, and all the analysts tell you, the campaign specialists who make millions of dollars, you don't campaign on foreign policy and you don't campaign on unconventional ideas. He threw that out the window and said, what about these endless wars? And when you're in Western Pennsylvania and Ohio and you're talking to people about endless wars and they've already lost children and loved ones, it made sense. He talked about having reciprocal trade deals. That seems pretty boring. But when you've lost your job, it means a lot to connect the dots back to an international agreement that privileges the Chinese. He talked about national sovereignty as the core unit of analysis in the international system instead of multilateral organizations. All of that meant a lot to voters that the Democrats in 2016 ignored. While Hillary Clinton and her team were in Pittsburgh, where I live, campaigning, Donald Trump was out in Moon Township. Even the Amish in my state formed political action committees to support Donald Trump. It's because of the foreign policy ideas, I think, that they really came to his side. So what's happening now is that those ideas of the state, the nation state as the core unit of analysis in the international system, reciprocal trade deals, reciprocal agreements of all sorts, pulling out of multilateral agreements that don't meet that test, like the Paris Climate Accord, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, all of that's being unraveled by the new administration. They're keeping the frame, but they don't understand that the frame wasn't the real part of what he did, it was the substance. The ideas about regional partnerships and burden sharing, making NATO countries pay their fair share, all of that was part of what he campaigned on. Almost nothing new emerged after the campaign because he'd worked out so many of his ideas. And those ideas, I think, were hand-tying commitments to the American public. So I think this administration is going to ultimately find its way back as much as it can to everything that Trump set out because they haven't done the hard intellectual work to understand that we're in a world that's so different than what happened in the Obama administration. The calendar year doesn't actually mark the beginning of a new century. It's usually some big event. We're finally in the 21st century now, and I think Donald Trump was the first in this century to set out a strategic doctrine.
That's terrific. I think you lay it out so very well. Thank you for sharing that. Now, Congressman McCaul, I'm going to give you an impossible task here. In just a few minutes, can you describe the threats you see out there in the world, kind of a brief overview of what you're seeing in the House of Representatives and what you're leading on?
Sure, and let me thank Heritage, everyone. Welcome to Texas. Welcome to freedom. It's nice to be here in person as well. And Mike, thanks for having me. In 3 minutes, I'm going to tell you about worldwide threats covering everything from Russia to China, Iran. When I chaired the Homeland Security Committee, it was really all about ISIS. That was the real big threat of the day. Trump ran on that. He was going to crush ISIS. He came in within a year. He destroyed ISIS, and as Chad knows, that was the biggest threat to the homeland in terms of external operations to kill Americans in the United States. That was hugely significant, and I don't think he ever really got the credit. The foreign policy, though, of America First, now I'm the top Republican on the Foreign Affairs Committee, It's really these foreign nation adversary states, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. And within just a matter of months, it's incredible what a reversal I've seen in policy between the Trump administration and now this new Biden administration. So I'll walk you through in the last 2 minutes I have. Not to mention the border crisis, which Chad's going to get into in depth, but a stroke of a pen reversing the agreements that I want to commend the Secretary for getting, remain in Mexico, asylum cooperation agreements with Central America, literally stopped the surge at the border, and in one day Biden reversed it, and now look at what we have. But when we look at, say, China, origins of COVID-19, there's been a lot of new declassified information that's come out that I have been privy to. For instance, the researchers at the lab were hospitalized in November of 2019 with flu-like symptoms consistent with COVID. They were researching corona-like viruses from bats, genetically mutating them to see how they would extrapolate to humans. How could they develop a vaccine for this? I believe, and I said on the Sunday show Sunday, that this was an accidental leak out of the laboratory. It happened in 2004 with SARS. And what they did systematically, silencing the doctors, destroying lab samples, and getting the WHO, because Tedros is President Xi's friend, not to announce a public health emergency alert, really covered up what was happening. And it went from an epidemic to a global pandemic. I chaired the China task force, and I get this question a lot. How can we hold China accountable? I really think it's supply chain. We have got to pull our supply chain out of the region and out of China. And that's primarily medical, which we saw they hoarded, to rare earth minerals, critical minerals. And then lastly, the advanced semiconductor chips that are in everything from your iPhone to the F-35. They put these chips to build their hypersonic missiles. So we pulled, the Trump administration started this. We got a bill going through Congress to do just that, incentivize manufacturing of advanced semiconductor right here in the United States, creating more jobs, manufacturing, protecting our national security. Quickly to Russia. I mean, I don't know how much more we can appease Putin. And this was a big knock on President Trump. And the irony is, we sanctioned the hell out of Russia. And we passed congressionally mandated sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. What did President Biden do? He shuts down the Keystone pipeline, which goes into my state, which is the cleanest way to transfer energy. And then he issues a national interest waiver to allow Putin to finish his pipeline into Europe. Meanwhile, he's shutting down drilling in Alaska right now, so we won't be energy independent like what Trump brought us into. And at the same time, how many cyber attacks are we going to endure from Russia without any consequences to Putin? I mean, whether it's solar winds right here in Austin, Texas, to what we saw, with USAID just the other day, the beef industry, constant attack from Russia, and then the Colonial Pipeline attack shutting down our energy supply and gas stations closing down. Finally, Iran is one of the biggest threats, the largest state sponsor of terror. They are, according to the Ayatollah, 40% or 60% enriched uranium capability. We think in a matter of 4 months, they could have enriched uranium to build a nuclear warhead, which will take them about a year. They have short-range missile capability that can hit Israel to the Gulf. You saw recently with the war between Hamas, 4,000 rockets into Israel. Somehow Israel gets portrayed as the perpetrator of all this, and Hamas the victim. It's just the opposite. And yet this is what we're seeing in Congress too, members of Congress with an anti-Semitic view of the world, anti-Israel. We got a lot of problems. And we're taking it really head on though and fighting this fight against the administration. I know Chad's gonna talk about the border, but when I talk about foreign policy, that was a foreign policy masterpiece, what they had pulled off. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you were able to cover so much ground so quickly. With regard to China, I think there should be some consequences maybe for starting an international pandemic, but what do I know? You know, it doesn't seem that the Biden administration is really leaning into that at all. So let's shift the convo back to the Homeland. We have former Secretary Chad Wolf of the Department of Homeland Security to talk about that. To put it simply, what is the state of Homeland Security?
Well, thanks, Mike. I appreciate Heritage inviting me to such an event. Jim Carafano, Laura Reese, Mike, the whole team's been great, so appreciate that. I'm not sure my comments are going to be any more rosy, uplifting. The state of the Homeland is it's pretty complex. The threats that we're facing today are more dynamic and more complex than we've ever really seen before. The Congressman touched on it. When we talk about Homeland Security, at least as I talk about Homeland Security, that is national security at the end of the day. We are confronting attacks from Russia, from China, from North Korea, from the transnational criminal organizations in Mexico, the cartels. This is national security, but it's also about economic security and what we do here in the homeland, whether it's cybersecurity and keeping critical infrastructure up and running so the economy continues to grow day after day after day is absolutely vital to everything when we talk about Homeland Security. So I think it's important to keep those in mind. But Homeland Security starts with leadership, and I think from this administration, we see a lack of leadership really from the top, from President Biden, Vice President Harris, all the way down to the DHS Secretary. Two of those have not visited the border, so we talk about border security. We're going to talk about a couple of different threats to the homeland. What we saw from President Trump, Vice President Pence, and others is they wanted to engage on the border. They wanted to understand it. They wanted to talk to the men and women and law enforcement down there. They wanted to talk to the ranchers, the folks here in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. They wanted to understand the border to try to solve a very, very difficult problem. We don't see that from the current administration. Even the DHS Secretary has been down there probably about 3, maybe 4 times. The largest crisis in 21 years. I can tell you I was down there probably 3 dozen to 4 dozen times in about 14 months. And we didn't have a crisis. We had some of the lowest numbers that we had, but we still had other issues there that required time and attention, required the Secretary to be down there. So I think it's critically important that when we talk about Homeland Security, that we talk about leadership. They need to be honest with the American people about the threats we're facing, particularly on the border, and I don't see them doing that today. They keep talking about how the border is closed and the border is secure. We heard Congressman Roy talk about 178,000 illegal apprehensions in 1 month alone. 1 month alone. The border is not closed. The border is not secure. I would never have made those comments. You can talk about the border being more secure than it has been in the past, but to say it's closed, to say it's secure, you're lying to the American people, and you're trying to cover up some basic failures that they have had over the last 4 months. And again, what we saw is them specifically tearing down successful programs simply because it was started by President Trump or initiated under the Trump administration, whether that was the Remain in Mexico program, that was our asylum cooperative agreements, it was Title 42, on and on and on. There was a number of a patchwork of policies that we had put in place because we understood what the cartels and the smugglers were doing. They were using our laws and our loopholes against us. We saw that back in 2018 and 19 during a crisis, and we slowly but surely shut that down over the course of about 10 months, and then it was all reversed, and it's specifically what we're seeing today. So I often talk about, and we can jump into this into great detail, the crisis that we're seeing today is self-inflicted. It's self-inflicted, and they have the ability to change it, to change course, and to secure that border almost overnight. We gave them the tools, we gave them the playbook. They have the ability, they have the authorities. It'd be great if Congress could do something about some of the longer-term immigration policies, but they have enough authority to solve this crisis today if they wanted to. They simply don't want to. They don't believe in border security. They don't believe in immigration interior enforcement. They don't believe in ICE. They very rarely do they believe in CBP and Border Patrol. They just fundamentally disagree on how to secure that border and what immigration enforcement should look like. And so it's very, very concerning. Look, when we talk about a couple other threats, we talk about counterterrorism. And I know Congressman McCaul, particularly when he was chairman, was a lot of what the department was doing was how do we counter the terrorist threat to the homeland? And I think over the course of, particularly the last 4 years, we've done a great job of that. Unfortunately, what we saw, again, at the beginning of the Biden administration is tearing down a number of policies that we saw there. So the best way to secure the homeland from terrorism is to make sure that we screen and we vet individuals coming to the U.S., whether that's to work, live, to visit, business, whatever it might be. You need to securely screen them and you need to vet them. And so what did the Biden administration do on the first day? They pulled down a security regime that allowed us to get more information from every country around the world than we had ever gotten before in the history of the department. We were getting more traveler information, we were getting more information about lost and stolen passports, we were getting more information from Interpol, and we required that from countries, and we said if you didn't give that to us, we're going to put restrictions on the types of folks that can come to the U.S. And so we did that, and we were getting more and more information from them than ever before. Biden administration canceled that on day one. So we are no longer getting critical information that CBP officers and others can do their job to make informed decisions about individuals coming here to the U.S. We instituted catch and release. Obviously, that's back in the forefront from an immigration perspective. We don't have the ability because of the number of people coming in every day, about 5,000 to 6,000 folks illegally coming in. We don't have the ability to screen and to vet those individuals on a real-time basis. The numbers are overwhelming. I've talked about this before. The system is broken as never before, so very, very concerning. And then I would say, you know, accelerating the refugee admissions program. We've heard a little bit about that in the news. And again, you want to make sure that you do that in a thoughtful way, and the number that the Biden administration has talked about, over 100,000, again, is going to outstrip the ability to vet these individuals and these populations. And I think that's very concerning. Just two other things I think about often when I talk about Homeland Security: cybersecurity, or I should say critical infrastructure. That's both physical and cybersecurity, making sure that we are protecting that. I think the Biden administration started off a little bit on the right foot. They've started looking at how do we regulate pipelines from a cybersecurity perspective, but it's not exactly the right approach, because obviously what did we see this week? Obviously it's the meat industry. So it's not just about pipelines. It's not just about one industry. We know that these cyber criminals are going to attack anything that's vulnerable, anything that allows them to make money. And so you need a more holistic approach about that. And then lastly, China. Obviously, the congressman talks about China. It's not just a foreign policy threat. It's not just a military threat. It's a threat here to the homeland, whether it's direct foreign investment from China, whether it is China influence in universities and college campuses through Confucius Institutes, or whether it's the abuse of our immigration visas, particularly our student visas, on college campuses, stealing information, stealing intellectual property. That's a real threat that the department needs to be focused on. I think we need to be focused on. I know Heritage is focused on it, and look forward to continuing to do a lot of work in those areas.
Thank you very much. Another optimistic picture was just painted for us here. I thought you made some great points about the leadership void at the department right now. And I would note for everyone in the audience that, you know, the Secretary and the White House have put forward a slate of senior nominees to lead all the component parts of the Department of Homeland Security. And they're basically all members of the Biden transition team who came up with these plans that were executed on day one to undo all of the successful Trump era policies and immigration enforcement. So keep your eye on that. I got word today that a couple dozen House Republicans will be sending a letter over to their Senate colleagues to urge them not to consider those nominations until conditions improve or our border czar, so to speak, actually visits the border, Kamala Harris. So we're staying focused on those things here at Heritage. Now I'd like to proceed to the question and answers from the audience point of the program. So if you're out there, please raise your hand. We have someone running microphones that'll get the mic to you. I just ask that you direct your question to one of the panelists so we know who can go. Right in the back there. Was that Jim? I don't know. He gets too much. I think I saw another hand right there. All right, go for it. That's the only hand I see.
Okay, so it's not fair because, okay, all these guys work for me, even McCaul. But I want to put this really tough issue on the table because it does concern all of us, because the president just came out and said the most dangerous domestic security threat we have today is white supremacy. And I don't think there's anybody that thinks white supremacism is a great idea. But to me, that seems like a politicization of domestic security. And I know, you know, Chad, in particular Chad and the congressman have really thought on this issue. Can you really give us an honest laydown of what should concern people in their communities every day?
Sure, I'll take a first stab at that. I also, thanks for bringing that up, Jim. I also heard that comment and was just shaking my head. As late as October of 2020, the department, while I was there, put out a Homeland threat assessment where we specifically said, and words matter in this case, when you look at the domestic violent extremist category within all the threats to the homeland, so you have foreign terrorist organizations, you have cyber criminals, you have cartels, you have a number of threats across the board. And within one is violent domestic extremists. And within that category, white supremacists, as far as lethality, are the most concerning. And somehow that phrase and that description got blown up to what we hear today from the president and others is now white supremacy is the #1 threat to the homeland. And that's just not true. It's not true on a variety of different fronts. It's hard to actually pinpoint what's the top threat to the homeland because whether it's foreign terrorist organization, whether it's natural disasters. If you live in the Gulf during hurricane season, that's probably your #1 threat. If you live in California during wildfire season, that's, a natural disaster is your #1 threat. But this idea that white supremacist is the #1 threat to the homeland today is not only absurd, it's simply not true. The facts don't back that up. The data does not back that up. And no one has called him on that. No one has called the department on that because the secretary at DHS continues to say something very similar, although his wording is a little different. And I think, again, we're playing on this notion, I think from January the 6th, of this is now some huge movement. What I saw when I was there, and then I'll let the congressman, is we saw violent domestic extremists in the summer of 2020. I saw them in Portland, and we saw them across around the country. Violent opportunists, Antifa and others. Where was the outrage? Where was the prosecutions? Where was the commission at that time? You didn't see it. You didn't see it because of political reasons. And so this whole idea and notion that we have Democrats jumping on the bandwagon here, my question to them, where were they in the summer when over 300 law enforcement officers from DHS were being injured every single night by violent extremists and opportunists? They were silent.
Yeah, I think it has been politicized. What happened January 6th was it was a dark day in our American history, and the members of Congress who were here experienced that. But it unfortunately has become politicized, and domestic terrorism is defined. USA Patriot Act right after 9/11. At that time, international terrorism, Al Qaeda was the #1 focus and the #1 threat. But Chad's correct. Extremism can take place. It's not just white supremacy. It's Antifa and all these other extreme groups that are out there that want to cause violence. And so the FBI is very focused, on this threat, as they should be. But then when I look at other threats, like Chad talked about, let's look at China and what they've been doing, through the 1,000 Talents program, Confucius Institute, Insidious inside the United States of America, and the theft of intellectual property. Keith Alexander, NSA admiral, he basically said that it's the largest transfer of wealth in human history. The theft of intellectual property that takes place every day from China, stealing out of the United States of America. Not too far from here is Houston, Texas. There's a reason why Mike Pompeo and others shut down the Houston consulate, because they were stealing so much from our Texas Medical Center, including research on the vaccine, including data from NASA. So we just shut down the consulate. Fortunately, they didn't have shredders, Mike, so we got a lot of good information out of there. As a former federal prosecutor, that's always a very good thing. But this is taking place, this is espionage. And I see that as a far greater threat than white supremacy, because the threat from China is real. And we're in a global, it's a competition, both militarily and economically. And I think people started to wake up after COVID that this is a real threat. When I talked to Mike Pompeo, I interviewed him at an event at Barton Creek down the road. It is long-term the greatest threat to our national security is the Chinese Communist Party and what they're doing. And they're also committing genocide, in the very provinces where they make solar panels, and slave labor. So we got to keep our eye on the real threats and not politicize threats that, while that is a concern, to Chad's point, it's not the number one threat that's out there.
Dr. Skinner?
Jim, thanks for asking that question. It's really a hard one, and it's at the intersection, I think, of domestic and foreign policy, but it is a broader question, I think, about the future of the conservative movement and the Republican Party. Because the argument about white supremacy is really an argument about race in America. And who wins that argument wins in 2024. And so it's so critical for conservatives to begin to take it on. I think it's right to try to get empirically rigorous about what is the biggest domestic threat. And I don't think white supremacy would really even make the top 50% of the rankings. But I do think it is objective to say that the biggest domestic threat in the country is the problem of K through 16, because it is the education system that allows us to believe that white supremacy is a major force in the beginning. The way that we teach U.S. history is to really erase the reality that white supremacy starts with the Democratic Party in the American South. And that is so, I think, critical to what we're doing. When you arrive on Capitol Hill and you're 24 years old, you have your first job working for a legislator, you're coming out of a K through 16 system where you did not have to take U.S. history, diplomatic history, military history, or basic economics to get your bachelor's degree. And in high school, all you had to do is take AP courses in American history and government and pass a test. That, to me, is a bigger problem that allows false narratives like white supremacy to take over. Heritage and others are doing kind of workarounds through internship programs and the way we're educating young people. But if we don't reclaim the academy, where I've spent my entire life, I think we lose.
Well said. We got another question from the audience right over here. Someone will run you a mic. And we're going to have some great panels on education coming up and sessions to really bring that point home. Go ahead.
Thank you all for speaking. This has been really wonderful. Looking at the national defense establishment, right, the career officials, the bureaucrats, they lean pretty heavily in one direction. Would you guys talk about why that has happened and how can we get more conservatives involved in that world? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question because I think, Dr. Skinner, as you well know, at the State Department, they weren't necessarily in the career level all too friendly and receptive. And Secretary Wolf, you know about DHS, and you obviously work closely with these agencies. So whoever would like to kind of talk about what we do to get the right staff, you know, who are actually not just partisan ideologues, to be frank, would be a great baseline into our national security apparatus. Any ideas on that front?
Let me take that one up because for me, that was the hardest part of serving in the Trump administration was that the reality, there's so much discussion about deep state. I was at the State Department. I saw very little, quote unquote, deep state careers that were out to defeat. It was the never Trump political appointees that, frankly, the Secretary of State himself appointed that undid most of what the president was attempting to do. So at the very last day of the Trump administration, at least for state, and I spent a year at the Defense Department last year at the Defense Business Board. So it was very similar. The very last day when they walked out of the building, I don't think there were but a handful of pro-Trump people who had served on the campaign, served on the transition, they had been purged. There is a civil war going on in the conservative party movement and the Republican Party now. And to just really, I think, to obliterate the MAGA part. And if that does happen, I think there's no future for the movement. Much of what the MAGA world stands for has been ill-formed. The job of the cabinet officials and the senior officials, I think, primarily was to turn the president's hunches and instincts into hypotheses. Many did not do that, but it's still the most robust part of the Republican Party, and it is the part that sees a future that's very different than the 20th century. And I'm really worried about not the deep state, but the civil war that we're under right now.
So, my perspective at DHS is mainly the law enforcement officers at DHS, and you have to think back, the department is the largest law enforcement agency in the country, in the world. So we have over about 80,000 law enforcement officers. These are folks that actually want to do their job. They want to enforce the law as it's written, not as someone interprets it or thinks it should be written. They want to do their job, they want to enforce the law. What I ran up against and what I saw was, particularly under the Trump administration, is career bureaucrats, they wanted to just go along with what the policy had been for years and years and years. It's just easier for them to do their job. Obviously, we took a different approach. And so as we were breaking China, not literally, but as we were mixing things up and going a different direction, it was very, very difficult. It required them to actually do work and do their job and to come about it from a different perspective, and they didn't like it. It's just easier to push back against that. So whether it was political appointees, and we had some of those as well that did not like the direction we were going, or just career bureaucrats, it was just easier not to just go along, to just do what we've been doing for years and years, most of which was not working, particularly in the immigration and border security space. And it was very difficult. It was rare to find the ones that said, okay, we're going to shake up the apple cart here a little bit, and we're going to do the hard thing, and that's going to require long hours, that's going to require weekends and the like. And there were a few of them, but from my perspective, it was they just wanted to sort of put in their 5-6 hour day, go along to get along, and not really push the agenda that we were there to push for 4 years.
Yeah, I've gone down to the border, seen our Border Patrol officer. They're very good people, and they're demoralized right now. They say 40% of my job now is taking care of these kids and driving buses, and it's not what they signed up for. They signed to protect America at the border. I've never seen the morale, and I think you'd agree with this, Chad, as bad as it is right now. So I guess to answer your question, I fear the political appointees of today. Like the new Secretary of Homeland Security, who is completely abdicating his responsibility, first and foremost, to protect America. I think the Trump foreign policy, as I saw it from Capitol Hill, was America first. Everything he did was about America first. That's why, some of us didn't always agree with tariffs and that kind of thing, but then we look back and it worked. They got these cooperation agreements with Central America and Mexico, and it worked. With China, he's the first president in my lifetime to stand up to China. When we used to sort of coddle, thinking we could win over China into the family of nations, and you know what? And James Baker told me this. He said, it just didn't happen. Condoleezza Rice said that. We tried. We thought we could normalize them, and it just didn't happen. So the political appointees really worry me today when I see what Blinken is doing with, again, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Putin. What's he going to do with, China? Are we going to get weak on China again? Because they only understand strength, and they're going to take advantage of our weakness. And that's the foreign policy that dictates how I view the world. It goes back to Churchill and Chamberlain and Reagan, peace through strength, and appeasement invites aggression. And it invited Hitler. And Reagan stood up to the communist Russia empire, Soviet Union, and brought it down. And it works. And I think that's a lot of what I saw as a core of what President Trump stood for as well. And I think now you're seeing a president, through their political appointees, not putting America first, not putting our interests first, but, let's talk to Iran about that JCPOA, because we want them to be our friends. And, hey, let's let Putin build that pipeline, and hey, China, you're just misunderstood, so let's just try to work it out. And it's a very naive foreign policy, and they don't understand how the real world operates.
Dr. Skinner, you want to bring us home?
Yes, I actually half agree with the congressman. I'm worried about the political appointees now, but I'm even more worried about the Trump political appointees who are on the outside gathering the resistance movement so that we can't come back. in 2024. And so that is a fundamental problem that's being underestimated. And they're forming all kinds of groups and organizations as Trump alums, but they don't believe in the America First agenda. And I think that they may have some success, and that they are in that way working with the current political appointees, not necessarily hand in hand, but in really pushing against this idea of America First. And just on a final note, I don't agree that China's the biggest threat to the United States. I think Trump did a remarkable job in helping build a consensus that China is a problem and developing a China trade policy. But the Trump administration never developed a strategy to combat China that was comprehensive. Rhetoric does not equal a policy, and I think the bigger threat facing our nation and our long-term survival is the growing power of the global South, a collection of nations that will be much more important to our future if we don't try to persuade them. I'm talking about not the BRICS so much, but Nigeria, South Africa, India, Pakistan, Brazil. We're not watching what they're doing, and collectively they're just more important in terms of minerals, in terms of population, in terms of all of the factors that matter for power, and we have no discussion about the coming power of the global South.
Well, we got time for one more question if anyone has one out there. I see one back there.
I really appreciated your comments there regarding the global South. Do you worry, though, that China itself does grasp that, and through the Belt and Road Initiative, they're going to be exploiting those and essentially almost creating a new colonialist empire of, Chinese client states across the world? And how do we respond to that?
Yeah, so the Belt and Road Initiative is, it's global. They go in with what they call debt traps. And I agree with you about United Nations has been was being taken over by the Chinese Communist Party. The head of the WHO, handpicked by President Xi. They were going to take over the intellectual property organization at the United Nations. I mean, how laughable would that be? And they have taken over a lot of these key positions within the UN. But what they do is they're a developing nation under the UN Charter, which is again laughable because they're the number 2 economic power. But that enables them to get low interest, loans from the World Bank, and then charge a usurious interest rate to developing nations through what they call debt traps, debt diplomacy, Belt and Road. So they go into, say, Sri Lanka, where they have now taken over a port, or in Africa and Djibouti, they've taken over that port. They're down to Panama Canal that Teddy Roosevelt built, Carter gave it back. Now the Chinese have ports down at the Panama Canal. And they get these countries into what they call a debt trap. They bring their own workers in, not the host country. They get them into such an enormous debt that they can literally take over that nation. It's been a very slow, systematic, worldwide event that we turned a blind eye to, quite frankly, for too long. And we have to compete with them. We have to compete with them in Africa and in Latin America through things like the Development Finance Corporation, the BUILD Act that we passed in the Congress. And how can we get our capital, our financing, how can we get our vaccines to counter the Chinese influence? How can we sell our military weapons to win over nations against China? Because like UAE, for instance, Abraham Accords, had we not sold them those weapons, they would have bought it from China. But now they're an ally, of the United States. So this has been, again, when I look at the entire scheme of the world, they have been extremely aggressive. And I also worry about the military posture. They took over Hong Kong without a shot fired. The human rights violations are just absolutely horrendous. And now they're looking at Taiwan. And they're in the South China Sea with artificial islands threatening all the countries in the South China Sea. He views it as imperial China. He wants imperial China back. Putin views the Soviet Union, wants that back. Erdogan wants, Ottoman Empire. Ayatollah, he wants Persia. And that's how they kind of see, that's their worldview as they see it.
Thank you for that. Secretary Wolf, like to jump in with anything on the topic?
Yeah, I would agree with the congressman. You know, during my travels to Central America, even to the Middle East, you know, we would see Chinese influence there, particularly during COVID, but even before COVID and certainly after. But I think the interesting part was all of those countries were eager to do business with the United States. They just needed us to engage. They needed us to understand what China was offering them, the stresses individually in those individual countries, whether it was economic stress, whether it was the military stress. They wanted the U.S. to engage, and it didn't matter where I went, and it was very interesting. You know, domestically, over the last 4 years, there was, particularly in media, a lot of anti-Trump. It didn't matter where I went overseas, they all loved President Trump because he talked very real about the threats, not only facing the U.S., but facing individual regions, whether it's the Middle East and the Abraham Accords or the like. He was plain spoken and talking about it. Now, I agree, we needed to turn some of that rhetoric into sort of a long-term strategic plan, but it was forceful. But the congressman's absolutely right. I mean, China is a threat around the world, and we saw that from a counterterrorism perspective at the department, making sure that we were the closest ally to a lot of strategically important countries around the world, and not letting China get that upper hand.
Yes, just 2 quick points. One, to the question about does China understand the Global South and its power? I think so. I think maybe Belt and Road Initiative is one example, but I think the work that it has done in the last few years, along with Russia, through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where they're picking off the countries of the Global South that will be important for the future and giving them membership as something like a counter to both NATO and the EU. It's being utterly ignored. It may not be that effective, but I do think it's a window into Chinese thinking. And then another point about China that I think I saw at the Trump revolution going into the administration is that China's not being taken seriously enough, I think, in Washington for being the first comprehensive global competitor the U.S. has faced. As an economic, political, military, and cultural great power competitor all at once. We've never had that. I made a kind of process file when I said that as a State Department official, and the political science community ganged up on me and said, what about Imperial Japan? And then I thought about it, that's true, but they didn't last very long. And they had a much more regional ambition for a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. China's just the first global one. We're not organized as a government, as a nation, and as policy experts to deal with this kind of comprehensive global competitor. And for whatever reason, language and culture specialists on China are largely excluded from the conversation in government about what we should be doing. I don't think we can survive this competition without the right human capital, and I don't see it being let in the door.
Yeah, can I just, and
yes,
Kiron's absolutely right. I see it as a generational challenge, economically, militarily, generational threat. When my father's generation, World War II, it was, he was a B-17 bombardier, bombed the Nazis. That was their challenge, against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Then we grew up during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And then we had 9/11. And now it's the great competition, the great generational threat for my kids and their children, I think, will be the Chinese Communist Party. Just to kind of put this in perspective from a threat standpoint.
I appreciate that. I think you all laid that out very, very well. I wish we could keep going. We could have this conversation for hours and hours. And that's because there's really no shortage of pressing challenges that we all face. But that means that everyone in this room has a lot of work to do. And I think our speakers, I want to thank them so much for being here and kind of laying out how they see the world. I think that was an excellent discussion that really laid it out and got into specifics and was able to cover a lot of ground. And there's just such a disparity between the way the world should be and what American leadership should be and what is happening now. And we just can't get numb to that. This is not sustainable, and we need to be the folks out there pushing for a course correction. And so I thank you all for all of your leadership in that effort and sharing with us your thoughts today. So let's give the panel a round of applause.